In order to understand the redemption that's happening right now, we have to understand the entanglement of Joseph in Egypt. You see, Joseph was sold by his brothers because of jealousy over the dreams that he had. Joseph dreamt that his parents, Rachel and Jacob, would bow down to him. And the brothers were jealous of him. So what did they do? They sell him into slavery. He goes to Egypt. The second he gets there, he gets put into the house of Pharaoh. And they give him the keys to everything. They see that God is with him. And when he's in the house of Pharaoh, Potiphar's wife, Joseph's future mother-in-law, tries to seduce him. But what happens? Joseph runs away. She tells everybody the story with her version, and what happens? They throw Joseph in jail. He sits in jail. Imagine what's going through his mind. My brothers sold me into slavery. Number one. I didn't do anything wrong. Number two, I come to the house of Pharaoh. So I get here, and they immediately raise me up, give me the keys to everything. And then I get seduced, and I don't fall. I hold on to the purity. He runs away from it. And what does he do? He ends up in jail. Imagine what he's thinking. Well, we really don't have to imagine, because the Torah actually tells us this. The Torah says that while he's sitting in jail, two people join him, the chief bartender and the one in charge of the bread. Why were they in jail? You see, a fly fell into the cup of Pharaoh. A fly is what caused them to enter into jail with Joseph, and because of this fly, Joseph ended up becoming the second in command, the viceroy to all of Egypt. Can you imagine that? What's the message over here? Furthermore, Joseph gets into jail. He's sitting there, and these two fine men join him. And they suddenly have a dream. And the bartender's dream was about grapes. Joseph immediately understood that the Jewish people are grapes. We're the wine. And therefore he said to him, you are going to go and be raised out of this jail, and you're going to be put back in your position. But he tells him, remember me. Remember that I am here, first of all, because my brothers sold me into slavery for nothing I've done wrong. And remember me, I did nothing wrong with Potiphar's wife. And he asks the bartender, remember me. Guess what? The bartender completely forgets him until Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh goes around the whole world. 2 years later, that's Genesis 41, where Pharaoh is looking for answers to his dream. Only then the bartender remembers Joseph. Our sages tell us that when Genesis 41 begins and says that it was after 2 years, the reason why 2 years went by was Joseph was being punished. Can you believe? Joseph, the righteous person, for what? Well, Joseph understood that the salvation, his salvation, coming out of jail, will come through this bartender. But he didn't understand that it wasn't because the bartender will want him to come out of jail. It will be because God forces the bartender to take him out of jail. And this is the point I want to get to. You see, Pharaoh, interestingly enough, needed to send the Jews out of Mitzrayim. And this bartender needed to be an instrument for Joseph to get out of jail. But Joseph's mistake was he thought that he could influence the bartender. He didn't realize that influences on flies, on a fly in the soup, in the cup of Pharaoh, could get him out of jail. And a dream could get him out of jail. So what's the message over here? What's really the story of why Joseph was put into this situation? What did Joseph ever do wrong? Now here I want to bring to you something very, very important to understand. That there are two big sins that every generation continues to live on about them. There's actually three, but I'm going to focus on one. The sin of selling the brother. How could a family, the 12 Shvatim, the 12 tribes, sell one of their brothers to Egypt? Now, the answer to this question, it's a difficult question. Hopefully we'll touch on it later on in this video. But for now, let's understand Joseph's perspective of what's going on. Joseph, from the moment he was sold into slavery, wanted one thing. He wanted to fix the brothers' sale of him. He understood how much damage this did in Shamayim, in heaven, that the brothers could sell him out. And we know that the Tikkun Zohar was written on Mechiras Yosef, on the sale of Yosef. Many things that we say in Rosh Hashanah prayers have to do with this sale of the brother. The entanglement of the Jewish people in Golus began with Joseph being sold by his brothers, and then him being successful, and then having something against him. But Joseph sat in jail and wondered, how did I get myself into this mess? What have I done wrong? I've done nothing wrong. And he even sends a message. But God says, you're sending the message will actually be against you, because you are now showing your faith in human beings. You're actually believing that this person who's higher level than you can do something for you that you can't do yourself. Now, obviously, we should try to get ourselves out of jail. And if we have a good reason to get out, we should. But sometimes, like the case of Joseph, when things happen in our lives that are so complex and so out of our control that we had no wrongdoing, we have to look at them and say, it's an act of God. Let's see how this plays out. Interestingly, the Torah in the middle of the story interjects with the story of Judah. And Judah takes a wife named Shua, who's a Canaanite, which we shouldn't be taking wives from Canaan. That's what Abraham said to Eliezer. But he does it anyways. And they have 2 kids, Er and Onan. Both of them did bad in God's eyes. And his daughter-in-law was left childless when his 2 sons died. He sends his daughter-in-law out, and then Judah's wife dies. Imagine, he lost his 2 kids and his wife in a very short time. And then the Torah tells us the most crazy story where Judah is walking and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, knows that he's there, and Yehuda goes and sleeps with Tamar, and she becomes pregnant. When he met her, he gave her his signet ring and said, this will be collateral for payment. Very strange story. But what happens is, 3 months later, Tamar, the Torah tells us, was pregnant. And they come to Judah and say, Tamar, your previous daughter-in-law has been found to be pregnant. She's the daughter of Shes. The law at the time was that a priestly daughter who commits prostitution is burnt at the stake. And that's what Judah said to do to her. And just before they burn her, Tamar pulls out the ring that Judah gave her and said, Haker no. These words mean, do you recognize this? The same words that Judah used when he took Joseph's coat and dipped it in blood and showed it to Jacob to theoretically tell Jacob that Joseph was dead. And she uses those same words to Judah and says, Haker no. Do you, anybody here recognize this ring? And this, at this point, Judah's 2 sons were killed. His ex-daughter-in-law was about to get killed. His wife was dead. And he saw the pain that Jacob was going through. And Judah, this was the moment that Judah grasped and said, "Tzadakt mimeni, I got her pregnant." And at that moment, Judah won the war. This was how Judah, from that pregnancy, came Peretz, the great-grandfather of King David. King David is the Mashiach. King David is the one, Mashiach ben David. And all this came from Judah with Tamar. And then the Torah goes right back to the story of Joseph and shows and contrasts the difference between Judah and Joseph. That Judah said, "I made a mistake." When he accused Joseph of being immoral, when he said, besides the dreams, they accused Joseph of being immoral with the daughters, with his stepsisters. But Joseph proved that he was not enticed by Eshes Potiphar. But Judah fell. But he repented, and he came back, and he came back stronger than ever, because he became the kingship, just like Joseph, but on a different level. Judah and Joseph were two kings. At the end of this story, what happens is, after Joseph becomes king, comes advisor to the king. So the brothers need food. There's no food in Eretz Yisrael. And what do? They go down to Joseph. Eventually, Joseph keeps pulling them along. And they go back, they hold on to Shimon. Eventually, they don't know that it's Joseph. And Joseph gets Binyamin, gets the whole family down in Egypt. All his brothers are there. And he stands in front of them. And we're going to get to that next week, the confrontation between Judah and Joseph. But at the very end, it says that Joseph went to the other room and began to cry. But he kept holding them on. He kept pulling them along. He kept making up what seems like stories, putting their money back in their thing. What was Joseph trying to do? Was he trying to pay them back? The one thing Joseph was worried about was the sale. He knew how terrible such a thing is, to sell out our brothers, to say they're not our brothers anymore. They're not part of us. And at the very end, Joseph, he couldn't hold it in anymore. And Joseph says, Ani Yosef, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And then he says, Ki lemichya sholchani, atem chashaftem al. You thought you're going to do bad to me by selling me into Egypt. Velokim, and God had his plan. The message, my friends, is that a fly in the cup of Paro can save the Jewish people, can save Joseph and get Joseph out of jail. And yes, the will of Pharaoh can be controlled by God. And the will of the bartender was controlled by God. Eventually, he had to admit that Joseph was the one who could answer the dream. Joseph had no secret to answering dreams. It was God speaking through him and telling us, for us to understand, that sometimes we don't understand why David went to Bathsheba. We don't understand why Judah went to Tamar. Certain things we don't understand. But King David came from that relationship. And Shlomo HaMelech came from Bathsheba, who built the Beis HaMikdash. And it was all because Judah said, I have sinned. King Shaul came from Joseph. King Shaul was also a tzaddik. Being righteous and being perfect has its problems. And we'll get to that in the next video. For now, I want to finish up what we started over here. We asked, what can we learn about exile and redemption from the story of Joseph? Well, first, we asked, what was the reason Joseph was sent into Egypt? Well, the Arizal writes the following. And he writes this in length to explain the exile of Egypt. That when Adam sinned for 130 years after he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, there were many children who came out from him, who got spread among the nations of the world. And these souls need to come back to the Jewish people. And we went into Egypt to collect these souls. How does the Jews get out of Eretz Yisrael? By fighting. By fighting with their own family. By not accepting the other Jews and saying, these Jews aren't kosher. These Jews don't do the way I do. And many times, by even taking the tzaddik out of Tzion. When you take the word that Megala Amuka says, when you take the letter out of Tzion, the tzaddik, you take Yosef out of Tzion, you're left with Yavan. And that's what it says in the Navi. V'orarti banayich Tzion al banayich Yavan. We need to have the tzaddik in Eretz Yisrael. We need to have the tzaddik in Tzion. And that's Shabbos, of being able to connect to Eretz Yisrael through Shabbat. Through every day of the week, we know this is 1 day from Shabbos, this is 2 days from Shabbos, this is 3 days from Shabbos. We asked further, what could we learn about the future redemption from the story of Joseph? Well, when Joseph's time on Rosh Hashanah came to come out of jail, Pharaoh had a dream that forced Joseph out of jail. It wasn't Joseph having the dream. God could have easily, miraculously broke the locks and Joseph is free. But it had to come from Mitzrayim. Hashem wants the Erev Rav. He wants the nations of the world to recognize that Hashem runs the world. And he could do this by hook or by crook. And with Pharaoh, God was so insistent that Pharaoh do the work for him. He wanted Pharaoh to send the Jews out of Mitzrayim. And he wanted the bartender to enable Joseph to get out of Egypt. But Joseph only returned to Eretz Yisrael, only returned to Israel as bones. And the last 3 days that the Jews were in exile, just before the redemption, Moses was running around looking for Joseph's bones. He was put in a lead coffin in the Nile, and he wrote on a piece of paper until Serach Bas Asher, an old lady, came and said that he's in the Nile. And he wrote on this parchment, Alei Shor, which means, rise, O ox. And the ox rose, that's Joseph, and they carried Joseph's bones for 40 years in the desert. 40 years they carried Joseph's bones until the time of Joshua, that they came into the land and buried Joseph. Joseph came back to Eretz Yisrael. But Joseph symbolized the tenacious Jew in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, being able to withstand the forces of temptation of Golus. But having that tzaddik in Golus was essential for them, but eventually it failed. Eventually they got entangled in Eretz Mitzrayim. And only Hashem could take them out. We asked, why 2 years? Well, he said to the bartender, V'zachreni v'zacharti, he said twice to remember me. 2 times. Why do you have to say twice? Why are you putting your faith in the bartender? Don't you realize that Hashem is speaking through you? That Hashem put the dream in his head, and then he came to you, and he gave you the answer, that we need 4 cups of wine. Thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button in the corner. Thank you for watching. Shavua Tov. Happy Hanukkah. And looking forward to chatting with you on the community site.